Thousands of years ago, vast glaciers began to chisel the landscape of North America. The Great Wisconsin Glacier was the last to push through Ohio. Its frozen mass carved the finishing geological features into the territory that would later be known as the Miami Valley. Winding through the heart of the valley is the Great Miami River. Feeding into the Great Miami from the east is the Mad River. To the west, the Great Miami joins the Stillwater River. Settlers were drawn to the river seeking its bounty of water and fertile soil. Later, its current supplied the energy to power mills and factories. The river was a source of sustenance and mystery. Along its banks, commerce was transacted and villages grew into cities. The abundance which the river had to offer was equaled only by its capacity for destruction. By the turn of the century, people living in Troy, Piqua, Dayton, Middletown, and Hamilton, as well as the surrounding rural areas, had seen their share of high water. The rolling hills and many waterways made the Miami Valley susceptible to flooding. As the Great Miami River passed through Dayton, taking on the flow of the Mad and Stillwater Rivers and Wolf Creek, its channel actually became narrower. S-shaped curves in the river increased the potential for flooding. Existing levees had proven to be inadequate, and citizens in Dayton were considering more effective measures. In March of 1913, equipment was in place to begin raising the levees, when storm clouds moved in. The rain began on Easter Sunday as three great storm systems converged over the Miami Valley. The frozen ground absorbed little of the rain. Water overflowed the streams and tributaries, bloating the Great Miami River, and the deluge continued. The ensuing flood of 1913 would be the worst natural disaster in the Miami Valley's history. The town of Piqua became the first casualty as rising water surged through the streets. The water rose steadily in downtown Troy. Near Dayton, a chilling litany of bells and whistles warned residents of impending disaster. On March 25th, floodwater overflowed the levees. South of Dayton, residents of Franklin and Middletown fled their homes. 3 of the 4 bridges in Hamilton collapsed. The 4th gave way several hours later, severing the town. Buildings were ripped from their foundations, and people scrambled for the highest spot they could find. Families sought refuge in their attics, but many were forced to break through the roofs and cling to the housetops. In Dayton, gas mains broke and entire city blocks were engulfed in fire. Rescuers commandeered any boat they could find, rowing through the streets in search of marooned survivors. Under the direction of its president, John Patterson, the National Cash Register Company in Dayton became a temporary boat factory and relief station. 10,000 people were rescued. Over 360 lost their lives. As people in the Miami Valley began the enormous task of rebuilding their lives, they vowed to protect themselves against another unpredictable assault from the rivers. Within weeks of the flood, residents of the Miami Valley began to organize. Adopting the slogan, "Remember the promises you made in the attic," the city of Dayton began a campaign to raise $2 million to initiate a flood control plan. Colonel Edward A. Deeds, vice president of NCR, took the lead in the campaign. A giant cash register on Dayton's courthouse rang up the daily contributions. 2 months later, more than 20,000 people in the Miami Valley had pledged $2,160,000. The money was used to hire Arthur Morgan, an engineer from Tennessee, to design a flood control plan. By October, Morgan had produced a preliminary report. It was determined that an effective plan would have to be a cooperative action throughout the entire Miami Valley. Among the report's recommendations was the construction of large dams, which would form retarding basins along the Great Miami River and its major tributaries. The key to the success of Arthur Morgan's plan was an integrated system of flood control features. Earthen dams were to be constructed across the Great Miami, Mad and Stillwater rivers, and across Twin and Loramie creeks. Levees would be raised and strengthened, and concrete revetments would be built along designated areas of the riverbank. Channels would be modified. Bridges would be rebuilt to allow more water to flow under them. Once the official flood control plans were released, the district set about securing rights to lands which fell within the floodplain. The funds for the construction of a headquarters for the Miami Conservancy District were donated by Colonel Deeds. The building stands within a stone's throw of the Great Miami River. To pay for the construction of the flood control system, the Miami Conservancy District sold nearly $35 million in bonds. No state or federal funds were used, and 83% of the original $2 million in pledges was repaid to the contributors. Meanwhile, the district began hiring staff. Arthur Morgan employed approximately 50 engineers for the project. The men were recruited from 7 foreign countries as well as 26 states in the Union. Tradesmen migrated from various parts of the U.S. Construction workers and mechanics numbered over 1,000. Collectively, they were the lifeblood of the enterprise. During World War I, machinery for domestic use was scarce. Morgan's men scoured the nation like treasure hunters, turning up used and often abandoned equipment. A big Bucyrus dragline was shoveled from beneath 6 feet of snow in Michigan. 3 machines were exhumed from a canal near Chicago, and another was dragged from a swamp in Mississippi. Equipment was transported to Dayton, where it was overhauled and reassembled. It was, for its time, the largest construction project ever undertaken in the U.S. Over the next 5 years, the district's engineers and machinists invented technologies which would set new standards in the field of hydraulic engineering. When the engineers needed a site to test one of their innovations, the hydraulic jump, Colonel Deeds volunteered the family swimming pool. The resulting technology solved a major problem in the design of earthen dams. Water accumulating upstream of each dam is discharged through conduits. The conduits release only as much water as can be handled by the channels downstream. But engineers estimated that during times of flooding, the extreme pressure and velocity of the water coming out of the conduits could reach 150,000 horsepower. Such a force would erode the banks of the channel and undermine the dam. The solution was the hydraulic jump. Water flows down a series of steps into a stilling basin where the water's energy is dissipated. In designing the hydraulic jump, the Miami Conservancy District made an original contribution to the field of hydraulic engineering. Flexible concrete revetments were another innovation pioneered by the Miami Conservancy District. Cast by the Price Brothers Company and transported to the construction sites, the slabs were linked into a flexible mat by galvanized iron ropes. Unlike solid slabs, the flexible revetments would shift and warp without cracking. Locomotives and dump cars were needed to move the heavy loads necessary for building the dams. Near the Germantown Dam, crews constructed railroad lines over 3 miles of rough hills in order to get locomotives to the site. For enlarging the river channels and building levees, the Conservancy District maintained its own miniature navy. The Dorothy Jean, named for John Patterson's daughter, was a familiar sight on the Great Miami River. Morgan's team operated under 2 design philosophies. The first was known as conclusive engineering analysis, which simply meant that every conceivable option was explored before one was settled on. A second approach, called dynamic design, allowed all designs to remain flexible, subject to frequent change, often at the last minute, as new information came to light. This open philosophy was enough to bring on nervous twitches in engineers schooled in a more rigid approach. But the district engineers thrived in the creative atmosphere. Morgan was also a progressive social engineer. appalled by the tar paper shacks in which most migrant construction workers were forced to live, he stated that human wreckage had been the terrible price paid by the glorious American epic of pioneering and nation building. In contrast, the Miami Conservancy District's construction camps were model villages. Arthur Morgan's wife designed attractive houses which could be economically built. All were equipped with electricity, water, and sewer systems. Except at Lockington Dam, which had a nearby village school, each camp had its own school. A variety of night classes were offered to employees at no cost. Unlike the familiar company town, each of the district's construction camps had its own democratic government. Elected representatives oversaw community and social services, education, finance, and safety. In 1923, 5 years after the Miami Conservancy District broke ground on the project, the major components of the official plan were finished. On the Stillwater River stands the Englewood Dam, 4,716 feet long. It is the largest of the 5 dams. The Lockington Dam on Laramie Creek was designed to reduce the flood crest at Troy and Piqua. Huffman Dam is located 6 miles above the mouth of the Mad River. Its retarding basin can accommodate 40 billion gallons of water. South of Dayton, across Twin Creek, is the Germantown Dam. And spanning the Great Miami River is the Taylorsville Dam. Existing levees were enlarged and strengthened. Channels were widened and, in some places, straightened. The flood control project was an engineering feat unequaled in its time. 50 years later, the work of the Miami Conservancy District would be designated a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark. In 1913, flooding in Hamilton brought a flow of 350,000 cubic feet of water per second. The new system was able to handle a runoff that was 40% greater. Since the completion of the project, the dams have held back floodwaters hundreds of times. During a flood in 1937, which devastated many parts of Ohio, water collecting behind the district's dams occupied less than 15% of the storage capacity. In 1959, communities in southwest Ohio and Indiana again faced devastating floods. Engineers estimate that without the Conservancy District's flood protection, downtown Hamilton and Dayton would have been covered with approximately 5 feet of water. During high water in 1982, the areas protected by the Miami Conservancy District sustained virtually no damage. But in nearby communities such as Fort Wayne, Indiana, sandbags and earthen levees failed to impede the flood waters. Scenes from the nation's Midwest in 1993 were a sobering reminder that many communities are more vulnerable to floodwaters than we might have believed. But in today's economy, few communities could afford to undertake a project with the scope of the Miami Conservancy District. No statue commemorates the enormous accomplishments of the visionaries who built a flood control system which continues to protect the Miami Valley nearly a century later. But historians Carl Becker and Patrick Nolan wrote that each person who participated in the labor might well have said of himself, "Si monumentum priu iris circumspice." To see my monument, just look around. But it's the words of Anatoly Feldman, a laborer on the Englewood Dam and self-proclaimed poet, which best capture the significance of the Miami Conservancy District. Ah, canst see the flood's sweeping water checked by this thing you build? Canst see the torrent's flood, eager to destroy, splintered to spray against this great base? Canst feel the bigness of your task, the lives, the infinite lives saved by your toiling? For most people, the river is no longer a source of sustenance or livelihood. Yet the human soul is drawn to its waters. When the river is calm, we are lulled by its rhythmic currents. During times of high water, we are compelled to seek out the river's most torrential passes, fascinated by its danger. If questioned today, many people would not be able to tell you what the Miami Conservancy District is. Most of those who survived the Great Flood of 1913 are gone, and the promises made in the attic are long since forgotten. But as the great Miami River winds through the valley, it touches the tangible evidence of promises made to a future generation.